Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mindful Crafting. We are starting this year off with darning. And before I get into how to do that and what we're going to be doing, I just wanted to talk about why I picked this for January. One, it's very cozy, but also I think there's a lot of pressure to throw everything out and start the year new and only have new things. And so I wanted to focus on putting some love into the things that we already have and sort of preparing them for the next year, and then finding some old things and making them useful again. So anyway, that's kind of the mindfulness aspect of this, just putting some care into the things we have. Okay, so you may have watched me struggle to thread a needle when we started. I finally have that threaded, but you're going to want to have a embroidery needle, or some sort of needle that has a wide enough eye for whatever thread you're using. So you're matching the thread to the garment that you are mending. So if you're mending a hole in a sweater, you might be using some really thick yarn. If you're mending a hole in a thin cotton sock, you might just be using sewing thread. It is totally up to you, and how you want to kind of match the thing that you're mending or not match it. If you want, to fix a hole in a sweater and you want a totally different color, different texture, that's awesome too. So today, I'm just going to be mending a sock because I think that's a very simple thing. It's a common thing. And for me, I will mend everything else before I mend a sock because they're fairly cheap to get new ones. And so then I end up with this pile of socks with holes in them. So yeah, I want to pay some attention to them. Let me see. Okay. So here's my sock. It's got a hole in it from breaking in a new pair of boots, and it just wore out that heel. So, all right, so I have that. And then I'm going to be using some blue embroidery thread. Normally, I would like to match my color, but I wanted to be able to show you the stitches. So I'm going to use this bright blue. Some people like that contrast. I like the challenge of trying to blend it in. But for practice, it's super good to be able to see your thread versus your garment. So I mentioned in the event description a thing called a darning egg or a darning mushroom. I don't have one of those, but they're very cool. They're very kind of old world looking little wooden forms. I see one. Yes. Oh, and it's even painted like a little mushroom. That's cute. Yeah, so if you're like professional mender, you can get one of those. So I don't have one of those, but I do have a dog. Oh yes, I see another one, the egg. Nice. So yeah, so I have a dog who likes playing fetch. So I stole a ball from him that I'm going to use as my darning mushroom. So it just depends on what you're mending and the size of the hole that you're mending. So if you had something like, your big toe busted through a sock and you just kind of need this smaller form, you could use a wine cork. If you're mending something really big, you could even use like the bottom of a mug or a cup. The trick is to have something that sort of fills that space. So you can see that sort of like takes the shape of a heel, but you don't want to stretch it out so much that you are ending up like altering the form of whatever you're mending, if that makes sense. Like if I jammed like a big, pint glass in here and was mending it, and then I'd end up with this huge heel on my sock that didn't actually fit my foot. So you just want it to be sort of loosely fitting on the form without stretching it. Okay. So let me see. I'm going to tilt my camera down so you can sort of see my workspace. Okay. Okay, cool. So I have this like tennis ball thing inside the sock, and you can see there's this big hole in it. All right, so got that ready to go. Again, if you have any questions coming up, I know not everyone is probably mending a sock, so just let me know if you're confused about anything. All right, so we have that, and then I'm gonna try to place that. Okay, so I've threaded my needle. I'm using some cotton embroidery thread, and I've actually, it's not the full thickness of the thread, I've actually split it. So there's the original, and that's what I'm using. It's kind of hard to tell, but it is thinner. So I just split, it's like a 6-strand thread, and I took 3 of the strands and just kind of pulled it down the middle. Okay. So I'm leaving, if you're not familiar with hand sewing, you want to thread your needle to leave about like a 6 or 8 inch tail through the needle so that you're not risking that thread coming out of the needle as you're pulling through and sewing. It's not the end of the world. It's just sort of annoying to have to rethread it all the time. So just leave yourself a little bit of a tail. And then we're going to start sewing. So you're going to want to start a little bit away from the hole that you're mending. That's going to give you just an area of reinforcement around the hole because this fabric has already broken through. So we want to give ourselves like not an enormous, but a little bit of a buffer zone to reinforce everything. So, all right, I'm going to start below, and I'm just going to do a line of stitches. So I'm just going up and down through the fabric. Okay, so I have a straight line, and then I'm going to pull through. Okay. And I'm going to leave myself this tail on the end so you can see I've done my stitches through the material, but I'm not tying a knot. And that is something that is hard for me with mending because I want to secure everything. But with darning, we are weaving new material, and we are going to weave in some of this tail at the end. And part of that is because you don't want to feel this knot in the material as you're wearing, especially a sock. Like that would drive me crazy. So yeah, so you have to just sort of be at peace with not tying a knot in your sewing. Okay, so I've done my 1 row, and then I'm going to start a row next to it. Because we're going to do a bunch of rows, and then we're going to change direction, and we're going to weave up and down through the rows that we made. So I'm trying to think about spacing. I don't want these rows to be super, super close together, but I also don't want them to be so far apart that I'm just have this loose piece of material. So I'm going to go maybe 1/8 of an inch over to start my next row. And I'm going to do exactly what I just did next to it. Don't worry about your stitches lining up perfectly with each other. That's totally fine. So going up and down through the material. And this is where you see that having something inside of it is really helpful, so that I'm not sewing the sock to the other side of the sock, because I have done that before and it's not fun. Okay. So now I've done 2 rows and now I've reached this hole. And it feels sort of weird, but you're just going to let the string cross the hole. Obviously, there's nothing for you to stitch in and out of. So you're just going to cross that and then keep stitching on the other side. And the main thing with this is that when you're pulling the needle through, you want to make sure that you're not pulling it too tight, because you want to leave that string not loose, but you want to leave it crossing that hole without too much tension, because we're not trying to sew this shut. We're trying to sew across it, if that makes sense. So when you're pulling through, just make sure that everything is still sort of staying flat here, and you're not pulling it too tight. As I said, if anybody has any questions, or if you're mending a different article of clothing and you want me to talk about that, that's totally cool. Just let me know. I'm starting to get some of these lines across the opening. Again, not pulling them super tight, and they look kind of wonky and uneven, and it's totally fine. So don't worry about your stitches being so perfectly straight, because we're going to go over this again as we start to weave it, and we will fix up a lot of that wonkiness. So I've reached the other side of the hole, but I'm going to do one more row for good measure. So I'm really reinforcing the fabric all around the fabric that's given out. I found if you just mend the one spot that's broken, you're going to have another hole right next to it pretty soon. So I want to be mindful of that. All right. How's everybody doing? Good. Trucking along. Do we have any questions before I change direction and show you the weaving process? No? Okay. All right, so we've done a pretty basic series of stitches, starting outside of the hole that we're trying to repair, and just going back and forth across it. So now we have these lines of thread going across, but that's not quite enough to really reinforce that fabric. So we're going to turn and we're going to make our way across the stitches we've just done. And this process requires a little bit more concentration in that we are weaving through the stitches we've made. So you're going to start with, you start over or under, but the point is that you're alternating them. So I'm going under my first stitch, over the next one, and I'm going to repeat that process and then make my way across this line. So the cool thing about darning is we are literally weaving new material on top of material that's given out. So unlike kind of sewing a hole shut or repairing, a rip in something, we are allowing that hole to still be there and we're weaving new material over it. And it just creates this super strong reinforcement there. So you have a whole new layer of sock basically that you've woven. Okay, so I got to the end and I ended under my last stitch. So I'm gonna start over as I make the next row. And with this process, you can make your rows a little closer together than you did last time, because you're really wanting to, similar to, to doing a weaving, you're wanting those rows to be really close up against each other. What kind of thread did you say you were using? I'm using cotton embroidery thread, but because this sock is medium to thin, instead of using the full thickness of the thread, I went ahead and split it. So I don't think this camera is high enough definition, but it's got 6 strands. And so I just pulled it apart and I took 3 of the strands, you can see splitting it. So yeah. The pro advice is to use thread that matches the fabric content of the thing that you're mending. So if you're mending something that's 100% wool, then you would find some wool yarn or thread to use for that. This sock is mostly cotton, some acrylic, but I just picked the cotton because I like the way it feels. Okay, so you can see I have a little bit of this weave started. If you're repairing a spot that's worn, how far around the area do you go? So that's up to you. It's also up to the garment. So for example, I'll just take this sock. For example, I'm mending the heel area, and my mend is going to be pretty chunky and flat. And so I don't want to go all the way down under the heel, because that's going to create just this huge block of sewing that might be kind of uncomfortable when I'm wearing it. So I have chosen to go maybe 1/4 inch on either side of the hole. I probably could have gone even further just to make sure that I'm catching all of the material that's starting to sort of wear away. But you know, the farther out you go, the more sewing you're going to need to do. So if you're like me and you're impatient, you know, I would say 1/4 inch was probably good. It also depends on how much your material is fraying. Like for this spot, this was rubbing on a really particular area of the shoe I was wearing, and so it just wore through that one hole. But if it's something like a really old shirt and it's totally falling apart, you might want to do kind of a bigger mending area, and just make sure that you're getting the most out of your, you know, your work that you're putting into it, and you're not going to have to turn around and mend it again a couple days later. So. There's also something I've noticed about mending my own clothes, which I've been really trying to do more, rather than getting new stuff, that I want to say it's called like the IKEA effect. I don't remember, but basically that if you've had to put time and energy into making something or setting it up, that you love it a lot more. And I've noticed that with the things I'm mending, even things that I have mended less than professionally, they become my favorite things because I've put so much energy into them. So we'll see what happens with this sock, but Okay, so now I've gotten to the actual hole, and you can see the strings going across it. And so now it's a little bit easier actually to do the weaving over the hole because you can see what you're weaving under and over. But I have been pretty casual with whether I'm catching each and every thread and going up and over it. But now that I'm at this hole, that weaving is really important. So I'm taking some extra time and making sure that I am going over and under every single thread. And then I'm also making sure that I'm not pulling it too tight. And you can even take this needle and kind of push the thread down that you've just brought across, similar to weaving on a little loom or something. You're kind of pushing it down, and that's just to make sure that it is sitting really tight next to the next thread, because this is a hole, so we're making new fabric, so we want to make sure that that fabric is actually tight. Okay, so I've got some coverage going on. If you can see, or everything's backwards on the camera. If you can see those threads crisscrossing, and I'm almost finished going across the hole. So moving right along. So I ended up using a really long string of thread for this, which turned out to be enough to finish my mend. But if you run out of thread at any point, just leave yourself a similar tail to the tail that we left at the beginning, and start a new piece of thread also with as long of a tail, if that makes sense. So you could have multiple tails kind of hanging off of the border of your mend, and that's totally fine because we will weave them in and cut them at the end. So yeah, don't worry about that. Okay, I'm going to do one more row and then finish this up. Okay, so it's not perfect, but it is a darn. So there we go. I haven't caught every single thread perfectly to weave over and under, but I have created a little square of extra fabric on my sock. And there we are. So if this was something that other people could see while I was wearing it, I might go back and fix some of the wonkiness, or maybe not. But because it's a sock, it'll be in my shoe. So, okay, so I'm going to go over the tails. As I said, I have a tendency to tie a bunch of knots in my sewing and make sure it'll never come out, but that is not how darning works. So we've created this really strong weave that's trapping all of these threads. So we're going to use that to weave in these tails. I will say I left myself an extra long tail so that I can do the weaving in, but I'm not going to use all of this and try to weave it in. So I'm just going to go diagonal across my mend, and I'm going to continue that sort of over under thing. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just trying to catch, 10 or so strands of sewing, so that I'm really weaving this tail in. And if you're wanting the look of it to match up with your stitching, you totally don't have to go diagonal. You can just go along the line of what you were already doing. But okay. So I've gone over and under a few times, and I'm going to pull this tail through. And again, I'm not pulling it super tight because I don't want it to pucker the part that I've sewn. So let's see, and it has blended in pretty well. Okay, and then just gonna trim it. There we go. So it feels wild to just leave this thread in there without tying it, but I promise it'll stay. So, all right. And then I'm going to take care of this tail that I started with. And to rethread this needle. Okay, so I've rethreaded my needle with that tail, and that's why you want to leave it extra long. It's just so much easier to thread the needle and weave it in if you have some spare room. And I'm going to do the diagonal that I did with the other tail, over and under, across most of my weave here. And again, you don't have to perfectly catch each strand. You're just trying to really get it woven in. And making sure not to pull it too tight. You can kind of pull at the edges of your mend and smooth it out before you trim anything. Okay. And just cut that off. All right, so I have done this with my sock right side out. So let's see what the inside looks like. Take that collar out. Okay. So that is the inside of the mend that I just did. If you're someone that really doesn't want that mend to show, you could be turning your article of clothing inside out before you do this process, and there will be less stitching showing on the outside. So if you see, like, that's the part that's going to show, and then that's the inside. So fewer stitches, but honestly, I like the square, so I'm glad I did that on the outside. But yeah, then we have a little repaired sock. If you have any kind of fraying from the original garment, you can trim that very carefully. Just make sure you don't cut the stitches that you just sewed in there. So yeah, not too bad. Does anybody have any questions or comments, anything? Back up. One thumbs up, thank you. I also wanted to show you an article of clothing that I have been mending for a few years now. I refuse to give up this shirt. I love it so much. But this is before I really learned to properly darn. So it's got a bunch of messy stitches on it. But this can kind of show you what it looks like when you're matching your stitches to your article of clothing. So I picked the closest green that I possibly could. And as you can see, there are just a million stitches in there. I used sewing thread for this, so super thin, took me forever. But I think it was worth it in that it matched the weight of the shirt. So I wasn't wearing a shirt with just a huge chunky mend on it. So yeah, and got a bunch more holes in it now, so I have some darning to do on that. But yeah, and it's one of my favorite pieces of clothing because I've put so many hours into it, so it's amazing how it works. All right. Has anyone mended anything? Can I see anybody's work? Oh, very nice. Yay, already wearing a sock. I love that. That's awesome.
I did
Very
this
cool.
a while ago, so it's been through a few wash already.
Oh, nice.
It held up very well.
That
and
looks great.
It's a home knit sock. So it was very well worth darning.
Yes, yeah. I have never knitted a sock. It looks very challenging. So
I didn't knit it either. I just darned.
Gotcha. see what else we have. A few more socks. Oh, very nice. That just blended right in. That looks great. You don't have to shrug it off. You did a great job. Oh, awesome. Oh, use a light bulb. Yes. I have never done that. I'm so scared of breaking it. But I have heard that, oh, it looks great. Yeah. Oh, you're mending both. Yeah. Do you mind unmuting?
My mother used a light bulb when she darned.
Oh, cool.
And so, yeah, I had a pair of socks. This is the darned one that I did during class.
Cool.
And so now I have to do the other side too. So it's just a worn spot. It's not a hole.
Yeah. That reminds me, I meant to talk about that it's definitely worth darning something even if it hasn't turned into a hole yet, because then
Right.
you've headed off that issue.
Right.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, I will, I'm not sure who was very interested in darning, but the library has so many books on darning and visible mending, the history of it, different techniques and stitches and stuff like that. So when I send out the recording, I'll send out that book list as well. I have them all checked out right now, so I will return them today so other people can check them out. But yeah, it's been really cool to see everybody's work, and yeah. All right, if we have a few minutes left, if anyone has any questions or comments or anything, please let me know. Thank you for being here. This is very, very peaceful. I have one renewed sock, so.
My grandma would darn a lot. She was very frugal, and my grandpa was a farmer and used up socks very quickly, but
yeah, I bet.
she would do it anytime. And my mom then wasn't quite as needy or poor as my grandma. So she said she mended socks, but never on Sunday, because it was just work. It was, if she did needlework, she would do embroidery or knit or something. But and I'm back to darning on Sundays because I find it relaxing and fun to do. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's whether you really need to do it or if it's work, I guess, in that scenario. But yeah, that's funny. Over the generations now, it's a nice, fun thing to do. That's so cool. Oh yes, slow stitching. Yeah, there are a ton of techniques for not only reinforcing and repairing things, but also adding some really beautiful decoration to your garment. So I will include some of those books as well. Yeah, if you're cultivating the patience of slow stitching, you can really decorate in an incredible way. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your work and your stories. This is really cool. So
thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'll
Very
see you
much.
later.
Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Thank you.